G'day ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Draw with Jazza. I'm Jazza and we're picking up where we left off in the last two tutorials. What we did in the first tutorial was create this animatic reference. We discussed the essentials of keyframe animation as well as breakdowns, and then once we've done the line work, we did the in-betweens and then did the coloring, which was an extremely long and boring process, but it is essential and that is part of it. So at this stage we're at now, what I'm going to be doing is refining the motion so that everything moves in good time, and also just doing little minor tweaks. Now these are quite essential. It might not seem like a very important thing to do once you've finished all this really hard work to get all this visual stuff happening, but it really is, and I'm going to talk about what that stuff is as we go through. So section by section, here's our first bit. We have this pull down, up, over, and then back, but he stops immediately. So the first kind of tweak that I'm going to talk about is a little bit of bounce back, right? So we have all this motion going into this position, but then when he gets there, it stops immediately and quite still. So a good thing to do is to create at least two keyframes here, duplicates of the first one. So if I go here, you can see I've got 1, 2, 3 frames that are copies of that one keyframe. On the first one, I'm going to hit Q, which is my keyboard shortcut to the quick transform tool. I'm going to drag him down a bit and skew him back. Okay, so you can see as I stroll back and forth between these, he's got that motion. On this one, I'm going to do the exact same thing, but just do less extreme in the positioning. So now when I go through these three, oop, that one went down a bit too much. So see, I'm refining the shape because I want him to angle back up, not that far. So we're perfecting it so that when he does that, he bounces back almost immediately, but it's subtle and it's quite important. It creates a sort of conveying weight and motion. He doesn't just magically stop in place. So we're just kind of scrolling back and forth to see how that looks until we get that diagonal sort of bounce back look that we want. Okay, and that's what I wanted. Bam. Okay, cool, bam. There you go. So that's a simple way that you can kind of help refine and accentuate emotion, is by, instead of stopping immediately, having a slight bounce back. That can be used for a lot of things. If you have a head that turns, instead of immediately stopping, the head can turn and then bounce back very, very slightly. Just that little slight bounce back is hugely useful. You have no idea. It's amazing. Here I have two keyframes of him flexing. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use those in reverse. I just want him to pause on the flex just for a couple more frames, and I'm going to use that whole thing again. So instead of just doing it in once, he goes in then out, and I want to position that so there's a bit of a space of time in which it's shown. So flex, and then he turns. Another thing you can do is, similarly to the bounce back, you can lead into the motion in the same sort of way. So for example, here we have him flopping over to the side to do his Superman pose, right? So instead of immediately going to this frame, I can create a duplicate of the first frame and drag it up and across like this. And if I do that twice and slowly lead into it, it just creates a little bit more of a warning that this is happening. I can actually duplicate this frame as well, and then when it goes to the very next frame, instead of immediately moving into other frames, I can duplicate that frame and keep the motion happening. So we're essentially using the same two images, but we're skewing and warping it so that the motion shows as beginning more dramatically. And as you can see, it's a bit more of a lead in. It's not an instant turn. And then same here, like we did earlier, we're going to give him a little bit of bounce back. So when we hit that end pose, because he's stomping down and moving in that sort of left direction, I'm going to do a bounce back with two new frames, and he's just going to get a little shorter and a little more to the left. And I'm going to do the same again on the next one, but less drastic. And then when we move across, you can see that we have that sort of bouncing motion. So when I play through, he has a bit of a lead in and a little bit of a bounce, and it really just smooths and softens the whole thing. Similar to how I used the frames again with the bicep, I'm going to do the same thing here again with these pec flexes. I have 4 new keyframes of the pecs flexing. I have 2 of the right one going up and then 2 of the left one going up. So I'm going to reuse the first right one going up again so that it goes up and then down again. and then I'm going to return back to the default one. Okay, so I'm just reusing it so that the motion goes in and then out, rather than just in and then stop back to normal. And then we're going to do the same thing with the other flex. So we're going in and then out and back to normal. What I'm doing to duplicate the keyframe, instead of Control-Alt-C copying and pasting the keyframe to another place, I can just click and drag from anywhere within the frame area that has that keyframe. So for example here, I just click and drag that frame over to where I wanted to move it. So now I've got this motion that goes in and out with each of the breast flexes. And I'm just gonna copy the first one, so he goes right, left, right. And I'm gonna do that by going up to the first right breast flex and just clicking and dragging that area over there. To properly copy the keyframe, you can't select the first one, because if I click and drag the first one, it actually moves the keyframe. It has to be on an area inside the keyframe space. So I'm gonna do that again with the two areas, so I've gone up and down again. So now I've got right breast position 1 and 2, and then 1 again, and then back to the default. And then I've got the left pec position 1 and 2, and then 1, and then back to the default. And then I've gone again with 1, 2 for the right one, 1, and then back to the default. So now when I play this through, he's flexing both of his titties and getting the attention of anyone standing by. Now, just to show a bit of the contrast between when we haven't fixed the motion with little tweaks and when we have, these are the two pose changes where I've added the tweaks. You can see everything's quite smooth. Whereas here when I play through, watch as he moves into going to do the next pose, see if it feels smoother or see if it's a bit jarring. Okay, so it's a subtle thing, but it's actually quite jarring because he just kind of immediately starts moving. So there are two things I want to do. I want to add a slow lead into the movement by adding a duplicate keyframe of this whole area here and just shrinking it and moving it to the right, because in the next frame he goes down and to the right. So I want to begin that motion. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make this whole motion much quicker, because as you can see here, I've got these warping areas in the limbs and in the finger. Now these are called animation smears. This is where you distort the geometry of what you're drawing to help accentuate speed in the motion. But in order for that to be effective, there actually has to be a bit of speed. And at the moment, I've got everything on doubles, which means every second keyframe, which means in this area, he's moving at about 15 frames a second because I've got my animation at 30 frames a second. So what I'm going to do is right here where there are the smears, I'm going to have everything on singles. And that makes the motion faster and it makes the smears more visually effective, but I also need to remember to add my little bounces at the end. Now I'm going to show you another little trick that you can use to kind of subdivide your bounces. So what I've got here is I've got his body kind of bopping back in the rightwards direction, whereas his left hand, which is moving quite fast, is going down instead of in the rightwards direction. So what I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to create two duplicate keyframes, 2 frames apart. Okay, so these are all the same keyframes. I'm going to select the leftmost one. I'm going to skew him back a bit. On the next one, I'm going to skew him back between the two. So we have that bouncing back motion. Okay, but now to subdivide it, I'm going to select that first duplicate. I'm going to hit Q and deselect what I had selected, and then I'm going to click and drag right there. So I've selected everything in this area, and I'm going to skew the hand down. I'm going to do the same again with the next frame, click and drag, as long as it's generally the same selection, and skew it down but slightly less. And what happens now is if you go through slowly, we have it bouncing backwards and the hand skewing up as well. So we actually have both little bounce back motions accentuated. So now we can play it through and it's got that slow lead in and a subtle bounce back that is actually more fluid with the motion he's doing, with the left hand moving down and the body having moved back and stopping. So it needs that bounce back. So now when I play all the way through, we have much more of a fluid motion with all of the transitions. And all it takes is a simple little tweak here and there just to show that the body doesn't stop immediately. there's always a little bit of whiplash. If you try and punch your hand forward as hard as you can, it's always going to go forward a tiny bit before it comes back. And that's just natural, it's just physics, and we're kind of accentuating that in our animation to show that these people have some physicality about them. So that's my short, simple tutorial today, ladies and gentlemen, on some tweaks that you can make to add a bit of bounce back and tweak the motion of your characters. I hope it's been helpful, and until next time, ladies and gentlemen, I will see you later.